Performance appraisal and discipline. The employee performance appraisal can be a very sensitive and emotionally charged experience for both the manager and the employee, but it is part of being a manager. It's one of the responsibilities that comes with that role. Performance appraisals are used to determine how well an employee is performing the expectations of their job, and it compares them in some ways against other individuals who are doing the same job. If it's done well and accurately, it actually can have good outcomes and improve employees' performance. One of the things the manager needs to be aware of, however, is that because employees come with past experiences, they may have had some negative experience with a performance appraisal or an unfair manager, and so when they come to this performance appraisal with you, they may be more fearful or resentful or anxious than you anticipate them to be. The number of factors that influence how effective a performance appraisal is. First, it should be based on a standard, and the employee should know what that standard is in advance of the evaluation. It needs to adequately and accurately assess their job performance, and as much as possible, employees need to be part of setting those standards. Letting the employee know in advance what those expectations are, that conversation really needs to start when individuals are hired and even in the interview process, so that employees know not only what they're signing on to, but what will be expected of them. The employees also need to know how you as a manager are going to gather that information about them, and the places where you gather that information really need to be from people who the employee works with on a regular basis. The person who does the appraisal needs to be someone who the employee trusts and respects, because if the information is gathered from someone who the employee believes is unfair or doesn't like them or has some other reason to have a biased opinion in this evaluation process, they need to have conversation with you about that. Employees need to get day-to-day feedback on how they're doing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the manager goes up to every employee every single day and says, okay, well, for today, your feedback is. But they do need to know on a relatively ongoing basis that they are meeting expectations. If there is a problem with how they're doing something, they need to know that as soon as that behavior happens so that they can correct it. They don't need to get that kind of a surprise at their performance appraisal. Remember that a performance appraisal is a total waste of time if all it's done is, if the only reason it's done is to meet the expectations and requirements of the job. It really needs to be a thoughtful and well-considered action by the manager. When you plan this appraisal interview with your employee, think about the feedback that you have given the employee over time, and think about the feedback that you want to provide for them during this interview. Also think about how you're going to say the things that you're going to say. You want to make sure that your words are well chosen and that that the employee clearly understands where they stand in terms of this appraisal. If you are too indirect or you're vague or you really don't communicate well, then the employee doesn't really understand what you expect them to do differently or how they've actually met or not met the expectations of their job. When organizations develop performance appraisal standards, As best they can, employees at those levels need to have some kind of input into how their performance is going to be evaluated. And if the employees believe that their job description and their evaluation process are tied together, they're less likely to think that the appraisal is done just basically on the manager's approval or disapproval of them. If they look at their appraisal as something that truly reflects what they are expected to do based on a job description, they are more likely to see the necessary changes as relevant to their continuation in the organization. There are a variety of pitfalls in performance appraisals. Subjectivity is always a problem because, you know, as managers, as individuals, we like and dislike certain aspects of people. We value certain things differently. So subjectivity can't ever be totally removed, but as a manager reflects on the process of the employee's evaluation, they can help remove some of those biases in how they look at things. There's a tendency to be lenient because it's easier. It doesn't create conflict. It's not very difficult if you're lenient, but at the same time, being lenient where one doesn't need to is not the appropriate way to deal with employees who are not exhibiting the performance that they're expected to. Inadequate record keeping is another big pitfall. A nurse manager cannot possibly remember what every employee has done for an entire year. And so it is important to have record of not only those counseling sessions where you expect things to change better, but things that you have learned along the way that the employee did well, or you know, maybe a letter from a patient that spoke to their professionalism or their kindness. You need to have those anecdotal notes along the way through the year so that you can refresh your memory. Another reason to have those is because if the employee says, well, you know, you didn't ever talk to me about being tardy, you can look back at your notes and say, well, on the 4th of November, we had a conversation because you've been tardy again. So it looks more professional and organized and accurate on your part if you have those records. There's a recency effect, and what this means is that the manager doesn't collect data over time, but they do it quickly at the last minute. Halo effect, horns effect, we will look at those in just a minute. And then there's the central tendency. What that is really is to look at all employees as meeting the criteria, whether they truly do or not. And so everybody gets essentially a satisfactory rather than recognition for jobs that are done extremely well or recognition of places where the employee needs to improve. The recency effect occurs when things that have happened most recently are what the manager looks at, and then those things are weighted more heavily in terms of how the employee has done across the year. It's not fair to the employee because they may have been having a bad day when that particular incident occurred, and it may look like they're a bad employee when in fact that was an isolated incident. The halo effect occurs when the person who's doing the appraisal lets one episode or one incident that the employee has done that was just really stellar or really sweet influence the assumption about the entire year and the employee's performance. For example, if you have an employee who doesn't really do a very good job, but the manager maybe had a death in the family, and the employee was very kind and very supportive and maybe sent flowers or something, and the manager thinks, well, that was just so nice of this employee, and then uses that to make an evaluation about how they are as an employee. The horns effect is essentially the opposite of that, making one negative thing stand out in your mind. Maybe an employee made you so angry that you're just going to do a bad evaluation on. None of those are really truly reflective of how the employee has done across the evaluation period, which is typically a year. And it's not fair, and it's not even ethical on the manager's part. A performance appraisal is more likely to be effective and have a good outcome if the appraiser is deemed to be someone who is respected and trusted by the employee. You also don't want to have surprises in the appraisal conference. Again, employees need to have ongoing information about how they're doing their jobs throughout the appraisal period. So if there's some major problem with their performance, they don't find out about it 6 months later at an appraisal conference and then get dinged for it when you should and could have told them earlier. An effective leader uses coaching and communication effectively with their staff so that they do know where their improvement needs to be and what things what behaviors they're demonstrating that are of concern or that they're doing well. And they need to be reminded that their performance is being evaluated based on a standard that everyone with that job description is held to. There are also some standards that every employee is held to. Things such as coming to work on time, completing your work while you're there, using resources effectively, that kind of thing. Employees also need to know in advance what will happen if the standards are not met. And again, this goes back to that early hiring interviewing process where employees are apprised of what are the consequences to not performing the way that they are expected to. For example, one system that I'm aware of has an 8 tardies over the entire period of your employment in that organization, and then you're terminated if you go past that 8. And so it's very important that those kinds of things be communicated to employees at the beginning so that they're aware of what the expectation and the consequence is. They need to know how information is going to be obtained. Who will you talk to? How will I be evaluated? Is it going to be basically based on my peers, or will it just be charge nurses, or will it just be the manager? The individual who provides input needs to be people who directly supervise that employee, and that would be like your charge nurse or your nurse leader on the unit. And remember that the outcomes of the appraisal process will be to some degree influenced by whether or not employees have had a positive or negative experience in the past. As a manager, the more trust your employees have in you and the more respect they have for you, even though they've had negative experiences in the past with other evaluations and other individuals, they are more likely to have a positive outcome with you based on that trust. So those relationships with employees are very key to an effective performance appraisal. Giving positive feedback. Some employees look at their performance review as an opportunity to be told how well they do, especially if they get very isolated and infrequent recognition for how well they do on a day-to-day basis. If the feedback is indirect or ambiguous, um, the employee really doesn't know if they have done well and if that is positive feedback or if they've done poorly, and are getting essentially counseled for that. A 360-degree evaluation is when the assessment of the individual is in part done by all the people who they influence or are influenced by within that setting. Management by objectives. This is where the employee and the supervisor sit down and discuss and agree upon some specific duties and responsibility of that employee's job, and then they set short-term goals and target dates for accomplishing those. Then, once they've agreed on that criteria, then they realize that they will be evaluated against the accomplishment of those goals. Using this management by objectives has actually been demonstrated to increase productivity and shows a significant buy-in by the employee because they were part of setting not only the goals but those objectives. In management by objectives, the manager and the employee will meet on a regular basis and discuss, how they're doing, where maybe they need additional support from the supervisor, but they talk about their progress to meet the goals. If they're not doing well at meeting the goals, it might be a time for a manager or a supervisor to do some counseling or some coaching on maybe how to do things differently. It might even be that the employee and the manager recognize that the goal was too lofty, or maybe the time frame was not adequate for them to accomplish that. During this conversation process, the manager is able to determine whether or not the employee has actually met the goals that they've set. And through this process, the focus is on the outcomes and the results that have been obtained, and not on whether or not this employee is a good employee or whether they're lazy or whether they're committed to things. Peer review has great potential for developing our professional accountability as nurses, but it's not something that is extremely well embraced, and therefore it's difficult to implement. People don't feel real comfortable evaluating their peers for several reasons. One, because they don't really like the idea of giving negative information if that's what would be given about a peer. They don't want maybe that retaliation or repercussion that might occur based on giving that feedback, and they're also not necessarily comfortable with their peers evaluating them. The manager's role in controlling their subordinates, of course, this is part of the responsibility as a manager. It comes with the position. Managers need to be able to know the difference between employees who need discipline and those who have other problems. Maybe they're chemically impaired, maybe they have psychological problems that prevent them from doing their job well. And then there's what we call marginal employees. These are the people who just pretty much do the bare minimum to get by. And the manager needs to recognize these different behaviors in subordinates and then how to manage those effectively. Progressive discipline can be used in some of the instances. It is inappropriate for others, and we'll talk a little bit more about progressive discipline in another slide. But it is not okay for the manager to just not discipline people, because what that does is it suggests to the people who are minding the rules that the fact that they're minding them really doesn't have any value, and that rule breakers are not going to be dealt with. So some employees will take it to be, well, if they don't have to mind the rules, why do I have to either? It can undermine morale. It can actually increase turnover on a unit, and it can undermine the respect and trust that individual staff members have in the leadership in the organization. Marginal employees are people whose their contribution is somewhat disruptive to the unit because of either the quality or the quantity of their work is only at minimal standards. These are the people who do the very least they can. They do it in not necessarily a sloppy manner, but not with the care and focus that you would expect from someone who's doing a good job. These employees sometimes make tremendous effort to meet competencies, yet usually manage only to meet minimal standards. A lot of times, and probably more often than not, these employees are very comfortable in just meeting the bare minimum that they're expected to, so that they can say, well, you know, I'm supposed to come to work on time every day, and I do, or I'm supposed to manage these 6 patients, and I do, but they don't contribute anything additional to the overall function of the unit or to the care of those patients for whom they're responsible. Typically, traditional discipline doesn't work with these people because more often than not, they're very comfortable with their behavior and they're not willing to change it. Looking at rules and rule breakers, managers need to not only know what the rules are, but they also need to watch to see what rules are being broken. If you see that your staff are breaking some rules over and over and over again, then you have to go back and look at that rule and say, is this something that's even relevant to now? Whose rule is this? Who made it? Maybe it had a point in time when it truly was needed, and now it doesn't. So you decide if a rule is worth keeping, then you need to enforce it. If it's not been kept for a long time, but it really needs to be enforced, then the manager would do best to make sure that the employees once again know that this is the rule and these are the consequences for not following it. It's very helpful if, as a manager, you will put that rule in writing. Give every employee their own copy of it, and for your files and the employees' files, keep a copy that the employee signed on a certain date that they were given this and that they agreed to abide by this rule, because then you can go back if an employee says, well, you didn't tell me we were supposed to do whatever this is, and you say, well, yes, because back here you signed it, you understood this rule, this was given to you, this information was given to you, and that you agreed to abide by it. And then it makes it easier for you to enforce those rules and levy the consequences. Some rules and regulations exist simply because they must to keep the organization moving forward, like people coming to work on time, parking in the right space, clocking in and out on time, or however the organization structures those types of things, that the employees follow them. It's important that as an organization and as a unit that the rules and regulations in the organization are reviewed periodically, so that things that are not any more appropriate or necessary are removed, and those things that are deemed to be worthy of keeping are consistently enforced and that they are regularly explained to individuals who are coming into the organization. Rule breaking is the most common reason why managers end up disciplining employees. So again, when you have rules and you see that they're being broken, ask yourself who made this rule and when was it made, and that sometimes will give you an idea of whether it's worth keeping or not. And then ask yourself, do we really need this rule? If it's an organizational rule and you as a manager see that it's not being kept up and it's not really relevant anymore, then you can use your communication skills to um, inquire into maybe removing that or modifying it to be more appropriate to the time that you're in, practicing in. Discipline versus punishment. The word discipline does not mean to punish, it means to teach, and yet very often if we talk about discipline we think punishment. But discipline is training or molding someone to exhibit certain behaviors that are desired. It can be considered punishment, but it is not the same thing. Punishment is what follows an undesirable or unaccepted behavior. It's that negative consequence that comes as a result of that inappropriate or undesired behavior, and then is hopefully what will change that behavior and redirect it to the acceptable behaviors. When we talk about disciplining people, our goal is to discipline constructively. And when we talk about constructive discipline, what we're talking about is discipline that is handled in such a way and is structured in such a way that it actually improves the employee's performance because it helps them grow, it helps them recognize where their behavior is not meeting expectations. It's done in a supportive manner, it is done to address the behavior, not the individual, so they recognize that it's their behavior that is being challenged. It is not their worth as a person or as an employee. We really want to help employees see how the behaviors that they've exhibited are not in line with the organization's goals or the unit goals, and that we believe that they are able to change those and then be in line with supporting those goals. Destructive discipline, on the other hand, does just the opposite. It actually demoralizes people. It's typically based on fear and threats. And what this does is it creates a level of distrust in the employee. They may become more agitated and fearful of what's going to happen next. They may start worrying about whether they're going to get terminated or what's the next penalty. When will the next shoe drop? They also don't trust in the fairness and consistency of the punishment or the expectation of following rules. So destructive discipline destroys morale. It undermines trust and respect. It can increase turnover in an organization, and it can actually create more conflict on a unit than it solves if it's handled inappropriately. Self-discipline is really where we want to be as professionals and as respectable and ethical people, because we do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and it's part of what guides our behaviors and our decision making. It's part of who we are. It's the most effective form and the highest form of discipline that you can achieve. And as a manager, this is where you want your staff to be. And one of the ways that you help them get there is by role modeling self-discipline, by using discipline and coaching and communication effectively. But it's only possible if your staff know what the expectations are and what will happen if they break the rules. They need to know that those rules are there for reasons and that everyone is expected to follow them and that you will be fair in administering those rules and whatever consequences are necessary should they be broken. Let's talk a little bit about progressive discipline. There are 4 common steps. Now, sometimes in organizations you'll see 3 steps, but typically there's 4. First is a verbal admonishment or a reminder that the individual is breaking a rule. Let's use coming to work on time as an example. You notice that one of your nurses has shown up late, and this is the 2nd day in a row, so you say to him, Bob, I noticed that for the last 2 days you've come to work late. I just want to remind you that the expectation is that you come to work on time. The rule is you clock in 15 minutes before your shift is supposed to start. It's very disruptive to the team if we have people late, because then we can't get on with organizing and delivering care in a timely manner. That verbal admonishment is all you do right then. So let's say that Bob comes in late again, maybe a week later. So now you write it down. You do a written counseling, and so you probably have his attention a little bit more than you did necessarily with the verbal admonishment, although for most employees a verbal admonishment is enough. But if it's not, then you write it down, and this becomes part of the employee's file. Most employees don't like that and are very quick to modify their behavior accordingly. If the behavior should persist, some organizations will suspend the individual without pay. Not all organizations will do this, and not all organizations do it at all levels. So as a manager, you need to know what is the process in your organization at your level for handling progressive discipline. And then certainly dismissal is the final phase of a progressive discipline process. If you're going to use progressive discipline, which again, most organizations have some form of it, they don't just fire you on the spot, you need to know that progressive discipline is appropriate for things that are fairly routine, like breaking rules, not coming to work on time, maybe not completing charts. However, there are some serious infractions for which progressive discipline is not appropriate. Let's say that you have a nurse who gets angry with a patient and jerks them by the arm out of bed, and they hit their leg on the bed post, and they have a huge hematoma. That's not something you say, I'm sorry, Susie, we really don't do that with our patients, and I don't want to see you do it again. That is not a progressive discipline issue. That is something for which you take immediate and swift action. With progressive discipline, once the employee has modified that behavior, let's say you write down, you've done the written admonishment, and you say for the next 6 months you will have no tardies, period, no tardies. So let's say at the end of that 6 months your employee has not had any tardies. So you wipe the slate clean. You're back to square one, and if they should start that tardy habit again, then you would go back through all of those stages of progressive discipline. If you have a disciplinary conference with an employee, you need to state the problem very clearly. Your frequent tardiness are creating a problem. Ask the employee why they haven't managed to improve their behavior. Now, Some employees will give you a list of excuses, and excuses are not necessarily reasons, and their excuses don't change the requirement to follow the rule, because again, remember, you want to be fair in administering the discipline and levying the expectations. So ask them why they haven't improved. Listen carefully and respectfully to them. Explain what is the next step in this. Maybe it's that they can't have any tardies for the next 6 months. Maybe it's that they're going to be suspended without pay. Just let them know whatever the next step is. Describe for them again, not that you haven't done it before, but you want to describe again very clearly what the expected behaviors are and the time frame in which you expect them. If you want them to come to work on time, you don't want them to start doing that 6 months down the road. You want them to do it immediately. You try to get an agreement and an acceptance of the plan. Not all employees are going to say, okay, I agree. The majority will. But if you have an employee who says, I'm not doing that, then you have a different problem. And so you might want to involve HR at that point. If the employee says, no, I'm not going to do it, you want to explore that with them, why. Maybe it's something they can't do. And as a manager, you would handle those incidences in various ways. But just know that you try to get an agreement and their willingness to follow this plan that you've clarified for them. Talking about impaired nurses, what an impaired nurse looks like can vary greatly. So you're not necessarily going to see the same behaviors or the same set of behaviors with every employee. You may see some of them, you may see all of them. But typically you see behavior changes in impaired nurses in 3 areas. Their behavior or personality will change. Maybe they're more moody, maybe they're more sluggish, maybe they're hyper when they didn't used to be. Their job performance may change. Maybe they're getting sloppier, they're cutting corners, they're becoming more forgetful, they're not doing things in a timely manner, and then their time and attendance may change. They may be late a lot, they may have absences in a pattern, like following a weekend off, they call in on a Monday, or they call in on a Friday before a weekend. So you may have changes in how they come to and attend work. Some of the chemicals that are most frequently abused by nurses, of course, alcohol is the most frequent one that we see, but Demerol, OxyContin, Clonopin, Valium, and morphine are also the most commonly used substances that nurses will abuse. As a nurse manager, when you confront a chemically impaired employee, you need to gather as much information as you can about their possible impairment, but you don't want to be so reluctant to take action that you wait for an extended period of time to do this, because it can put patients in jeopardy. So gather the information. If you have maybe one of your staff nurses comes to you and says, you know, I've been watching Barbara work, and she's coming to work more disheveled looking, and she just doesn't look kept up like she used to. Maybe she slurs her words a little bit, and I'm concerned about maybe she is, I don't know, hungover. And so as a manager, you might want to make a concerted effort to go watch Barbara's behavior, maybe to have a conversation with her and be in close enough proximity with her that if there were alcohol on her breath, you could smell it. Pay attention to how she's grooming or not, and how that is consistent with her pattern. You might want to look at her charting. Is it more, does it have more gaps in its frequency or its quality? This was a little bit easier to determine when we did written charting, because you could very clearly see um, a sloppiness or an increase in sloppiness in handwriting. Um, when you confront the individual, you need to do it in a timely manner so that you don't leave clients at risk, and you need to do it in a way that isn't so disruptive to the unit that it creates a big scene. You want to do it quickly. You want to do it in private if you can. And you should expect that they're going to deny it. That is very typical for them to say, oh no, I'm not. Before you have this conversation with them, you need to alert HR and probably the person who you answer to as the manager, so that you know exactly what the expectations of the organization are, exactly what steps you're to follow, what documents you're to complete, who you keep in this loop of information. This is not a time for a manager to befriend the individual, to nurture them, to try to make excuses for them. It's not your role to be their counselor. It is your role to be the advocate for the patients and staff on the unit, and to keep patients safe and the function of the unit going smoothly. You also want to advocate for this individual in getting them the assistance that they need, even if they don't see you as their advocate right then. You need to outline the plan for the employee that's expected for how they're going to process to overcome this impairment, or move through the process as an employee within the organization given their impairment. As a manager, you also need to be aware of what those reentry guidelines are for nurses who are recovering. Know what the standards are from the board's perspective, as well as what they are from your organization's perspective. Typically, these nurses are not allowed to use any psychoactive drugs. They may be assigned to a day shift for a year or so that there's more people and more leadership oversight. They can be, if one is available, paired with a successfully recovering nurse. This isn't always possible, because you might not have a recovering nurse on your unit, or a unit that has a successfully recovering nurse might not be a skill set that the particular nurse from your unit has. The employee also has to be willing to consent to random drug screens or alcohol screenings throughout the process. If at any point the manager is concerned about a relapse, the employee has agreed to be tested. The employee also has to provide evidence that they are participating in ongoing support groups such as AA or NA, and they need to be encouraged by leadership to follow through with those organizations, to be encouraged to participate actively in them, so that they can be as well supported through their recovery process as possible. Aftercare programs, again, encouraging employees to participate in aftercare programs, because they really do help the employee make that transition from impairment back to a state of sobriety. And encourage employees to have counseling sessions with a therapist if necessary. Some people think that, that's for crazy people. Well, it can be supportive of individuals who are in the recovery process as well. You should always have a formal grievance process in place in your organization and on your unit. As a manager, you need to know what that is. And whenever you discipline employees, you need to make them aware that there is a grievance process and how they should function through that. It's essentially a statement of what we do with people who have done something wrong within the organization. Um, if you have union contracts, um, those those steps may look different. They may involve um, entities external to the organization. So you need to know what those policies are. Um, a formal grievance process typically lodges a complaint in a progressive manner up the chain of command in an organization. And then if there isn't resolution using that grievance process, then typically the dispute or the disagreement will proceed on to arbitration. There are rights and responsibilities in grievance resolution on both sides. The organization has an obligation as does the individual who's lodging the grievance. Both parties have a right and a responsibility to listen and to be heard. So when there is opportunity for discussion, there needs to be listening and speaking that is allowed for both parties. The employee has a right to a positive work environment, but they also have a responsibility as an employee and as a professional to express their discontent or their displeasure with the organization or the unit or the leadership in a responsible and appropriate manner. Managers have a right to expect that their employees are going to follow the rules, but the responsibility that the manager has is to make sure that they have clearly outlined what those rules and responsibilities are for the employees and that they hold them accountable. There are strategies to make sure that your performance appraisal is accurate and that if it progresses to discipline, that there is a consistent pattern of fairness and accuracy. As managers, we need to make sure that we're aware of our own biases and prejudices before we enter into performance appraisal and discipline activities with employees. There's some people we don't like. You have to work a little bit harder to be fair with them to make sure that you're fair. But don't wait so long to take action that you actually create more of a problem. Use appropriate consultation. Ask for the input of your peers who have been through this similar process so that you know you're on the right track. If there are concerns that you have that maybe your dislike or distrust of a particular employee who needs to have an appraisal done or some disciplinary action taken, make sure that you balance your perspective against that of someone who maybe sees the employee in a different light than you do. Make sure you have appropriate gathering of information and that you do it over an appropriate time frame to represent this appraisal and or this counseling session. Keep anecdotal notes, which would include positive as well as counseling data, negative data on the employee. Also asking the employee how they think they're doing, keeping notes about that will help you determine if the employee doesn't think they're doing anything wrong and you clearly think they are. It may just be that they don't fully understand what they're expected to do, and you would need to clarify that. You also want to make sure that you don't use the horns or halo effect or central tendency trap or the Matthew effect. Termination should always be a last resort when dealing with poor performance. Now remember, if it's something egregious, termination is oftentimes the very first thing that you would do if you had someone who was abusing patients. you don't want to go have a verbal admonishment with them. You very often will go straight to termination, or somebody who is stealing things from the organization would be an immediate termination. But performance that's poor, for people who are demonstrating that, termination really needs to be the last resort, um, because you want to exhaust as many of the opportunities as you can reasonably do to help the employee change that behavior. Termination is always difficult for everyone concerned. Employees don't like being terminated. Employers don't like doing it. However, if an employee needs to be terminated, you're not, as the manager, the only person who recognizes that they need to go. Your staff do, and your staff will be watching to see how you handle this employee, and if you do it in a fair and appropriate manner, because that's how you can build and keep trust with your other employees, as well as maintaining a high level of morale on your unit. When you get to the termination conference, you want to, again, tell them exactly what's happened and why they're being terminated, explain the process, which may include, you meet with me now, and then you leave your badge and your keys with me. You go to HR and you sign whatever documents, and let them know exactly what that process is. Very often employees are going to want to know when they get paid, and depending on organization policy and the law in different areas, it may be that they have to, if they're terminated on a certain day, they have to be paid within a certain time frame. So you will want to at least direct the employee to where they get that information. Ask for their input and listen respectfully. Stay calm. This is not a time where you're going to negotiate a new change of behavior. The termination determination has been met, has been decided, and so let them have their say. Very often you will find out things in a termination conference from employees that they might not otherwise have told you. Some of it may be said in spite or retaliation or anger, but you do want to make note of that information, because it may help you solve other problems that are on the unit. Depending on your hospital policy and your experience with the employee, probably not a good idea to have this conference by yourself with the employee. You might want to have another nurse manager or a charge nurse or an HR person present as well. If you think that this can turn into a very perhaps volatile situation, you might want to alert HR and security, and have security nearby in case you need them. Try to end the meeting on a positive note as best you can. Even if you are totally overjoyed that this person is being terminated and will be off of your problem list, try to be positive with them. Thank them for their contribution. Thank them for their time coming to this conference. Thank them for expressing their concerns, and then let them move on to the next phase. Connecting key concepts. Consider how the nurse manager uses power and communication and decision making in how they deal with rule breakers and how they discipline employees. Consider the different leadership and management roles in appraising people and in doing their disciplinary conferences and various activities that are involved in the discipline. Consider how the nurse manager is being an advocate when he or she is dealing with an impaired employee. Reflect on how the manager uses personal and positional power to enforce rules. Remember, if you have a lot of referent power and trust with your employees, you're not as likely to have to use your positional power. But certainly you have that positional power for people who continue to break rules, because that is where you levy the discipline. Reflect on how the manager's assumptions about staff influence performance appraisal and discipline, and how that manager's view of employees generally and specifically with employees maybe who they don't like, how that can influence the way that discipline and performance appraisals are done, and the outcomes of those